In the winter of 1976, a young woman in rural Germany whispered a final prayer with lips too weak to move and eyes too hollow to recognize the world around her. Her voice had been recorded for months, twisting, growling, shifting into tones no human throat should be capable of making. Some said she was battling forces older than Scripture itself. Others believed she was trapped inside a dying mind, abandoned by the very people meant to save her. But the truth is far more disturbing, because every scream, every wound, every ritual was real, and none of it stopped what came next. Before the world ever heard the name Emily Rose, there was a real girl whose suffering carved its way into history. Her name was Anneliese Michel. She wasn't a myth, or folklore, or a legend shaped by centuries of exaggeration. She was a daughter, a student, a devout young woman who wanted nothing more than to live a quiet and faithful life. Yet somehow, her path led her into one of the most controversial and disturbing exorcism cases the modern world has ever seen. Her story did not unfold in a lonely medieval village or a forgotten church. It happened in the 1970s, a time of doctors, hospitals, research, and rational explanations, but none of it could fully explain what was happening to her. The experts saw a medical mystery spinning out of control. Her family saw a soul under attack. The priests saw a darkness they believed only ritual could confront. And Anneliese, she saw something that no one else could understand. What followed were months of prayers, recordings, rituals, and agony that blurred the line between faith and fear. It raised questions that remain unanswered decades later. Was she truly haunted by something inhuman, or was she abandoned by science when she needed it most? Tonight we return to the beginning, not the Hollywood version, but the real events that inspired it. The tragedy, the doubt, the devotion, and the terror that still echoes through every telling of her name. The strangeness began quietly, so quietly that no one in the Michel family noticed anything unusual at first. Anneliese had always been sensitive, gentle, and deeply spiritual. When she prayed with her whole heart. When she felt troubled, she carried her worries in silence. So the first signs came disguised as things any young student might experience: exhaustion, restless nights, anxiety she couldn't explain. It was only later, looking back, that her family realized how sharply the shadows had started to lengthen around her. It began with the nights. Anneliese stopped sleeping. She said something was keeping her awake, something that hovered near her bed when the house fell silent. She didn't describe it as a person or a figure. Instead, she said it felt like the air itself shifted. She felt watched, judged, weighed. Sometimes she jolted awake gasping, certain she had been pressed down by an unseen force. Her mother tried comforting her, telling her it was only stress. But Anneliese's eyes told another story. She knew what nightmares felt like. This was not a dream. Then came the voices, soft at first. Whispers she couldn't understand. She said they spoke from corners, from behind furniture, from the darkened stairwell. They didn't speak words she recognized, but she felt them. A pressure in her skull, a pulse beneath her skin. She began covering her ears at night, holding her hands so tightly against her head that her knuckles went white. The voices would not leave. And then the exhaustion turned into something else: episodes. Her body suddenly stiffening, her limbs locking as though seized by invisible hands. Doctors called them seizures, but even that explanation felt incomplete. The episodes came without warning, sometimes during meals, sometimes when she prayed. Afterward, she described sensations no medical textbook could contain: cold current rushing through her spine, a choking weight on her chest, the sharp sense of something standing directly behind her. Soon her behavior began to change, not violently, not dramatically, just subtly enough to unsettle everyone around her. She stopped eating certain foods for reasons she couldn't explain. She avoided religious objects, even though faith had always been her comfort. She could barely look at a crucifix anymore. She said it burned her eyes. And when her mother asked why, she simply shook her head. She didn't know the answer. One evening, while praying the rosary with her family, Anneliese suddenly froze. Her gaze locked on something no one else could see. Her lips parted, but no words came out. Her breathing grew shallow. The beads slipped from her fingers and scattered across the floor. She trembled like someone standing in a bitter wind. When her father reached for her, she recoiled as though his touch had scorched her. When she finally spoke, her voice was strained, almost unfamiliar. She whispered that something was in the room, something that hated the prayer, After that night, the household atmosphere changed. Everyone felt it. The silence in the house became heavy, the nights colder. Even the family dog growled at empty corners. And Anneliese herself seemed caught between moments of startling clarity and terrifying confusion. She would speak normally 1 minute, and then suddenly fall into muttering, as if answering someone only she could hear. Then came the scratching. It happened at night, faint at first, like nails brushing lightly against wood. The sound came from inside the walls, beneath the floorboards, along the hallway outside her bedroom. When her parents checked, nothing was there. But the noise always returned, louder each time. One night, her sister heard something similar to a distant animal clawing frantically, as though trapped inside the house. Soon after, Anneliese began waking up with bruises along her arms and legs. She had no memory of how she got them. Some looked like she had been grabbed. Others looked as though she had been kneeling for hours on a hard surface. She tried to hide them, wearing long sleeves even in warm weather, but her family noticed, and fear began to weave itself into their daily life. And then, one night, something happened that even the most skeptical member of the family could not explain away. Anneliese was found on the floor of her bedroom at dawn, her body twisted in a painful arch, her nails broken against the wooden boards. Her breath was ragged, her eyes glassy. But what caught her mother's attention most was her expression, an expression that did not belong to the girl she raised. Her face was contorted, lips curled, eyes staring past the ceiling as though focused on something towering above her. When she finally collapsed, her whole body went limp. She didn't wake for several minutes. When she regained consciousness, she didn't remember the episode, but she remembered something else. She said she felt dirty, like something had moved through her, something that wasn't her own emotion or thought. She said she felt invaded. The voices returned with more clarity after that. They no longer whispered. They spoke directly to her. Some mocked her prayers, some ordered her to stop eating, some simply growled. She said they were many, not one. And their words filled her with terror. Her world shrank. She stopped going to classes. She avoided friends. When she did speak, it was often in fragmented sentences, as though wrestling with something inside her mind. Her family felt helpless. Doctors suggested stronger medication, but Anneliese herself insisted that something deeper was wrong. She said it wasn't her brain attacking her, it was something else. And then came the moment when she cried out, shaking uncontrollably, that she saw faces. Distorted, monstrous, hovering inches from her own. She described them in a trembling whisper: hollow eyes, twisted grins, mouths that moved in mockery of her prayers. She said they tormented her, followed her room to room, and waited for her in the silence. It became clear something was happening that medicine could not fully contain. Her family realized they were watching their daughter slip into a darkness they could neither name nor escape. And with every passing day, the boundary between reality and terror grew thinner. The house felt colder, the nights longer, and Anneliese says she was no longer fighting just exhaustion or fear. She was fighting something unseen, something relentless, something that wanted more than her body. By 1975, Anneliese Michel's life had become unrecognizable. Friends rarely saw her, her health was deteriorating, her mind tormented. Medical explanations had failed, leaving the family desperate for answers. Doctors had tried prescribing medications, adjusting doses, exploring mental health conditions. Temporal lobe epilepsy had been diagnosed, and medications were administered to control the seizures, but they did little to quiet the voices she heard. Some reports noted hallucinations, disorientation, and mood swings. Yet, even with careful monitoring, the symptoms persisted. The girl they loved seemed increasingly consumed by something neither brain scans nor psychiatrists could reach. Her parents, Joseph and Anna, had always been devout Catholics, steeped in faith and the traditions of old Bavaria. They had taught their children to see suffering as a pathway to salvation, to endure pain for the sins of the world. When medicine offered no relief, the Michel family turned once again to faith, seeking answers from those who had power over the spiritual realm. For years, their pleas had been ignored. Priests dismissed Anneliese's condition as psychological or physical, steering the family toward therapists and neurologists. But the desperation of watching a child suffer broke down every hesitation. Finally, a local priest, Father Ernst Alt, heard their story and did something few had done before. He listened. He met Anneliese privately, observing her behaviors, listening to her descriptions of voices, sensations, and the weight of unseen presences pressing against her. He noted the intensity of her convulsions, the unnatural contortions of her body, and the alarming phenomena that accompanied her episodes. Though skeptical of the supernatural himself, he was struck by the consistency and extremity of her reports. Something beyond ordinary illness appeared to be unfolding. Alt documented what he observed meticulously, knowing that these records might someday serve as proof, explanation, or warning. Seeking guidance, Alt consulted the bishop of the diocese, Joseph Stangl. Church doctrine was clear: exorcisms could only be performed with official approval. But years of skepticism and bureaucratic hesitancy had left the family desperate. When presented with Alt's detailed observations and the mounting evidence of Annelise's suffering, Bishop Stangl reluctantly granted permission. It was a decision not taken lightly, a delicate balance between adherence to protocol and compassion for a tormented soul. The stage was set. Father Alt enlisted the help of Father Arnold Renz, a priest experienced in the rites of exorcism. They approached the case with caution, aware that the Church rarely sanctioned exorcisms in modern times, particularly when psychiatric conditions were a factor. Yet, they believed there was something distinct about Annelise's suffering, a pattern that defied scientific explanation. The first exorcism would take place in September of 1975, conducted in the Michel family home under strict observation. Records from this period reveal meticulous documentation. The priests recorded the dates, times, and lengths of each ritual. In total, Anneliese underwent 67 exorcism sessions, each lasting between 1 and 4 hours. The priests observed changes in her voice, her expressions, and her body during these sessions. They noted growls that were not her own, a speaking in languages she had studied but never mastered in speech, and movements that seemed impossible for a human body. Alt's journals meticulously captured every detail, providing a chilling account of her progressive deterioration. Simultaneously, medical documentation continued. Doctors monitored Annelise's epilepsy, her malnutrition, and the physical toll of her convulsions. They noted bruises, contusions, and muscle atrophy consistent with repeated stress and restraint. While the medical community attributed her behavior to a combination of mental illness and untreated epilepsy, the priests interpreted the same evidence as the manifestations of spiritual torment. These dual perspectives created an uneasy tension. Was this an illness, a possession, or some complex combination of both? Family testimonies added another layer. Relatives described nights when Anneliese would speak in voices that were not hers, voices that commanded, insulted, or wept. They recalled episodes where she would contort her body, throw objects, or lash out unpredictably. Siblings described the house as heavy with tension, as if a presence lingered in the shadows. Friends recounted brief encounters with Anneliese, where her gaze seemed distant, as though she were speaking to someone unseen. All accounts converged: her suffering was undeniable, and its source remained shrouded in mystery. Historical research into exorcism practices of the Roman Catholic Church revealed the rarity of sanctioned interventions in modern Europe. The rituals performed by Alt and Renz followed the Ritual Romanum, a manual codified centuries earlier. The rites involved prayers, invocations, and blessings intended to expel malevolent spirits. These ceremonies were designed to be comprehensive, addressing the spiritual, emotional, and physical dimensions of possession. Yet, reading the priest's notes, one sees the repeated struggle. Anneliese's condition resisted every invocation, every prayer. Each session intensified, not alleviated, the manifestations they sought to dispel. During the investigation, the priests also identified 6 named entities that Anneliese claimed occupied her body. These names, recorded verbatim in the exorcism logs, included figures both historical and symbolic: Cain, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Adolf Hitler, a disgraced local priest, and Lucifer. Whether one interprets these as literal spirits, psychological archetypes, or projections of trauma, their presence dominated every ritual. The priest described shifts in her voice and demeanor corresponding to each entity, noting patterns and responses. To them, these were not metaphorical. They were evidence of a battle that unfolded in real time, inside a human vessel. Court documents later revealed that family members and priests acted under Anneliese's consent. She reportedly requested the exorcisms, believing that her suffering could save others' souls. This voluntary compliance complicates the narrative. Was she a victim of ignorance, an instrument of divine will, or a patient whose consent was compromised by delusion and fear? The investigation into these questions would ultimately reach a courtroom, but within the walls of the Michel home, the reality was immediate, intimate, and horrifying. Investigators also examined audio recordings of the exorcisms. While only fragments were ever released publicly, the recordings captured guttural sounds, unusual speech patterns, and vocal shifts that challenged explanation. The priest's annotations corresponded to specific reactions, noting when voices seemed to speak independently of Annelise's conscious control. Medical experts would later analyze these recordings, acknowledging the difficulty of reconciling them with normal human physiology. To the priests, they were proof of the entity's presence. To skeptics, they were disturbing but not definitive. Regardless, these documents provided a permanent record of what transpired, a chilling insight into the extremity of her ordeal. The investigation did not stop at home. Church authorities, neurologists, and psychologists all contributed reports, creating a layered archive of evidence. The contrasts were stark. Medical reports emphasized the physiological and neurological components: temporal lobe epilepsy, malnutrition, possible psychosis. Church reports emphasized spiritual phenomena, resistance to sacramentals, verbal assertions of possession, and ritual responses. The intersection of these interpretations left no clear answer, only deeper questions about the nature of suffering, belief, and the unknown. By the time the exorcisms concluded, the investigation had documented an almost unfathomable degree of human endurance and torment. Annelise's weight had plummeted. Her body bore the marks of repeated restraint and extreme exertion. Yet her own accounts consistently framed her suffering as voluntary and redemptive, crucibles she endured to protect others. Family members, while horrified, largely supported this interpretation. Their devotion blurred the lines between care, faith, and complicity. Even decades later, researchers and journalists revisiting the case uncover these records and confront the same questions. What is undeniable is that meticulous investigation occurred at every level: medical, familial, spiritual. Every note, every testimony, every recording paints a consistent portrait of a young woman whose reality was consumed by forces that neither science nor faith could wholly contain. The investigation reveals that this was not a single event, nor a single interpretation. It was a tapestry of suffering, observation, and inquiry that challenges understanding. The case of Anneliese Michel remains one of the most documented exorcisms in history precisely because of the dedication of those who recorded it. Father Alt and Father Renz's journals, medical evaluations, family accounts, and surviving audio provide an extensive evidentiary trail. Every detail adds weight to a story that continues to provoke, terrify, and divide. Investigators searching for rational explanation find themselves facing phenomena that test the boundaries of reason. Those inclined towards spiritual interpretation find evidence of a battle against forces unseen, manifest in ways both subtle and extreme. As the investigation unfolded, one truth became impossible to ignore: this was no ordinary illness, and it was no ordinary suffering. Every seizure, every whispered voice, every episode of contortion, every bruise and laceration, and every repeated prayer was now meticulously recorded, analyzed, and cataloged. The question remained: what was real, what was imagined, and what lies somewhere in between, where science and faith intersect in the most terrifying ways imaginable? The investigation, thorough and relentless, left the world with more questions than answers, and with evidence that ensured Anneliese Michel's ordeal would never be forgotten. As the exorcisms continued, the line between reality and terror became almost impossible to distinguish. Anneliese Michel's body and mind were breaking under relentless strain, yet she persisted, driven by something she could neither see nor fully explain. The priests documented every session with careful precision, recording the growls, the guttural voices, and the sudden contortions of her body. Every single note pointed toward the extraordinary, toward something that defied conventional understanding. But what was it, exactly? The world would never agree on a single answer. Some saw the explanation in the most rational light. Medical experts emphasized the neurological and psychological dimensions: temporal lobe epilepsy, psychosis, delusions exacerbated by malnutrition, and untreated mental illness. Temporal lobe epilepsy, in particular, is known to alter perception, memory, and emotion. Patients can experience hallucinations, hear voices, and display behaviors completely beyond their control. For those who lean toward this explanation, Anneliese's affliction was the culmination of compounding conditions: amplified by intense religious upbringing and isolation. Her devout mother had instilled in her a belief that suffering had spiritual significance. Annelise's own fear, guilt, and desire to atone became entwined with her symptoms, creating an internal crucible that no medicine could reach. Others saw something far darker. They examined the priest's records, the exorcism transcripts, and the surviving audio tapes, and concluded that no neurological disorder could account for what they witnessed. The voices, some speaking languages she could not have mastered, the physical contortions beyond ordinary human capacity, the intensity of her reactions to sacramentals, these pointed to forces beyond the natural. 6 distinct entities, the priests noted, seemed to occupy her: Cain, Judas Iscariot, Nero, Hitler, a disgraced priest, and Lucifer himself. The variations in voice, posture, and demeanor aligned with the identity of the entity being addressed. In this framework, Annelise's suffering was no accident. She was a battleground, a vessel caught between worlds, and the rituals were the Church's only attempt to intervene. The truth may lie somewhere between these extremes. Some historians and psychologists argue that Annelise's devout upbringing, combined with severe epilepsy and psychological stress, created a fertile ground for possession-like experiences. The timing of the exorcisms, just after the release of The Exorcist in Germany, cannot be ignored. Exposure to the film may have provided a template for what possession looked like, influencing her subconscious responses. Episodes in which she barked like a dog, ate insects, or contorted her body could have been involuntary expressions of neurological distress, consciously or subconsciously influenced by cultural expectations of possession. In this interpretation, her mind became both prison and stage, playing out a horror story she had internalized. Yet the priests and many within the Catholic community remain convinced of the spiritual reality. They point to her reactions to crucifixes and holy water, which intensified as the sessions progressed. Her refusal to eat and the severity of her physical deterioration were framed not merely as symptoms, but as acts of redemptive suffering. Anneliese reportedly believed her torment could save the souls of others. In the priest's view, her unwavering faith, her endurance, and her verbal testimonies were evidence that something beyond human comprehension had taken hold. The records of her behavior, the reactions of the household, and the sheer extremity of her suffering created a compelling narrative that medicine alone could not fully explain. Legal and forensic investigations later complicated matters. Anneliese's death from malnutrition and dehydration was clear, but responsibility became a tangled web. Did the priest act with benevolent intention, or did their faith blind them to the dangers of their methods? Did her parents genuinely act to protect their daughter, or were they complicit in prolonging her suffering in the name of salvation? The courts ultimately found the priests and parents guilty of manslaughter by negligence, but the sentences were suspended. The legal system recognized that intention, faith, and tragedy had collided in ways that defied conventional punishment. In the public eye, Anneliese became both victim and martyr, a symbol of the terrifying intersection between belief and vulnerability. Several modern analyses have tried to reconcile these perspectives. Neurologists point to brain scarring, epilepsy-induced hallucinations, and the effects of starvation on cognitive function as plausible causes for her extreme behaviors. Psychologists highlight the influence of intense religious indoctrination, social isolation, and psychological trauma. Yet every time these medical explanations are presented, the exorcism logs stand as a counterpoint, meticulous, detailed, and chillingly consistent. The growls, the multilingual utterances, the sudden knowledge of hidden facts, all seem to evade a strictly scientific account. For those willing to accept the spiritual explanation, Anneliese's case remains a rare and horrifying confirmation of the Church's ancient teachings on demonic possession. The 6 named entities, the physical contortions, the vocal transformations, all are cited as undeniable evidence of forces unseen. The priest's own records convey fear, reverence, and awe, documenting encounters that seem to stretch the limits of human endurance. The idea that these sessions were voluntary, and that Anneliese believed her suffering could redeem others, adds a layer of tragic heroism to an already nightmarish story. And yet, even believers must grapple with the consequences. 10 months of exorcisms left her near death. The combination of exhaustion, physical restraint, and voluntary fasting became lethal. The rituals had failed to expel the entities, if they existed, and had contributed to her demise, if they did not. The priest's intentions, though rooted in faith, collided with the inescapable reality of human vulnerability. The theological explanation for her suffering, while compelling to some, cannot erase the tangible suffering she endured or the irreversible consequences that followed. Perhaps the most haunting element of the case is its ambiguity. No single narrative explains everything. The medical perspective captures many aspects of her behavior, but cannot fully account for the voices and the extreme physical phenomena. The spiritual perspective explains the unexplainable, but struggles with medical evidence and the neurological realities of her condition. Anneliese Michel herself becomes the central enigma. Was she a patient in need of medical intervention, a martyr of faith, or a vessel for forces beyond human comprehension? Each answer, partial as it may be, reveals something terrifying about the limits of understanding. Some scholars propose a synthesis. They suggest that Annelise's epilepsy, psychological fragility, and intense religious conditioning interacted with cultural expectations of possession to create a perfect storm. In this model, the exorcisms themselves may have reinforced and intensified her symptoms. Each ritual, intended to free her, also validated the reality of the unseen forces she experienced. Her voluntary compliance and her belief in redemptive suffering magnified the effect. Whether one interprets this as spiritual reality or an extreme psychological and physiological reaction, the outcome is the same: a young woman pushed to the edge of death, captured in a web of fear, faith, and mystery. The tapes, journals, and testimonies remain the core of the debate. Listeners and readers often report a creeping unease, as if the recordings themselves carry a resonance that goes beyond explanation. The sounds, the patterns, the consistency. Some say it defies imitation. Those who study the case cannot ignore the sheer dedication and precision with which the events were documented. Every growl, every contortion, every whisper is preserved in text or audio, awaiting interpretation. In the end, the reveal is not simple. There is no single truth that satisfies both reason and belief. The theory that Anneliese Michel was possessed is as plausible to some as the theory that she suffered from compounded neurological and psychological conditions is to others. What is undeniable is the enormity of her suffering, the intensity of her experience, and the way her story challenges everything we think we know about the intersection of mind, body, and spirit. Her life, her death, and the exorcisms that consumed her existence remain a haunting testament, whether viewed as a medical tragedy, a spiritual war, or a combination of both. The story leaves us with more questions than answers, and perhaps that is the ultimate terror. How something can defy our understanding so completely, leaving only fear, fascination, and speculation in its wake. The story of Anneliese Michel lingers long after the last exorcism, long after the final page has been written. Her ordeal, meticulously recorded and fiercely debated, reminds us that some mysteries do not fade with time, they echo. They whisper through the corridors of memory, through the minds of those who dare to listen, and through the shadows of places once touched by fear. If her story unsettles you, if it makes the hairs on the back of your neck rise, know that you are not alone. The records, the testimonies, the evidence, they remain, waiting for those who seek understanding, for those willing to confront the unknown. For more stories that blur the line between reality and horror, between faith and fear, follow ARCANE TESTAMENT. Here, history and legend converge, and the whispers of the past are given voice once more. Remember always, some truths are too dark to ignore, and some fears never sleep.